Are you ready to dive into a world of darkness and horror? Edgar Nightmare brings you the ultimate coloring book for those who dare to go beyond the realm of the ordinary. Each page of this dark fantasy is a gateway to a sinister and chilling universe filled with terrifying creatures that will leave you questioning what lurks in the shadows as you breathe life into these spine-chilling designs. This book is not for the faint of heart. It's for those who crave the thrill of the unknown and are not afraid to embrace their inner darkness. In fact, I would say it's the perfect thing to do while listening to horror stories on channels like mine. So if you're ready to enter a realm of terror and unlock your creative potential, order your copy of the Dark Fantasy Horror Coloring Book on Amazon today. This experience happened during the winter of 2019. I was 24 back then, and this was the year I finally moved out of my parents' house after working hard and saving up my money. I was able to find a 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom house about 20 minutes away from where my parents live. I was elated to finally have a place of my own. When I got home from work, it was just me, myself, and I, and on the weekends I could sleep in and get out of bed whenever I wanted to. I could relax and not worry about being interrupted by my parents calling my name, asking me to do chores, or give me shit about something I did wrong or something I didn't do. Finally, I had what some might call freedom. On the night of February 13th, I was in my room watching YouTube videos on my phone, and I suddenly heard a loud knock on my front door. In general, I always got slightly nervous whenever a stranger would knock at the door, but it was around 11 p.m. at night, and the fact that someone was knocking at this hour was even more nerve-wracking. But I figured if I ignored them, they would take the hint and leave. I went back to watching YouTube videos. 5 minutes later, the knocking came again. I decided to look out of my bedroom window and saw a large man wearing a black trench coat standing there. My blood turned to ice. His appearance reminded me of Mr. X from Resident Evil 2. Yeah, no way in hell I'm opening the door for that guy. As I waited for him to go away, I heard the man trying to open the door. I was now in full panic mode. The door was locked, but this guy was not giving up. He began to kick the door over and over again. Instead of calling the police, like I should have, I got my pistol from the nightstand and loaded it. I made my way to the hallway where the front door was located. The man's arm came smashing through the small window on the door and reached down for the lock. I fired a shot, hitting him in the forearm. He didn't flinch in pain. He didn't grunt. He didn't make a sound. What the? After a momentary pause, he proceeded to unlock the door and made his way inside. I retreated up the stairs to my bedroom, taking aim at the doorway. I heard the man stomping up the stairs, making his way right to where I was. After kicking in my door, I came face to face with the trenchcoat man. I saw him reaching into his pocket, and I did not hesitate. I emptied the magazine, landing multiple shots in the chest and stomach. The man fell to the floor. I quickly stepped over his body as I made my way outside. However, I did look back one last time before descending the stairs to see the man somehow getting back up. I called up the police and waited for them down the street from my house. By the time they showed up and searched my home, the trenchcoat man was gone, leaving a smashed up front door and a pool of blood outside my bedroom. The officers took my statement before leaving. After the incident, my landlord installed another front door that had no windows on it and was much more solid. He also installed security alarms and cameras, and even lowered my monthly rent to convince me to stay. This was an isolated incident, and the area is generally safe to live in, so I decided to stay. I still live alone to this very day, and I still enjoy it, but I now get a bit paranoid at night. Whenever I sleep, I lock my bedroom door to provide myself extra security and peace of mind. I just hope that the trenchcoat man never returns. This happened to me in my sophomore year of high school. Some people listening to this may have heard about the story when it happened, as it was all over the news, but I would like to tell my story anonymously for personal reasons, but you can call me Damien. I was in my second period English class. I am in a special ed program, just throwing that out there for you to keep in mind for context. That day my teacher, Mr. Wade, had a scavenger hunt planned for us in the schoolyard. Mr. Wade is one of those teachers who I really enjoy being around and look forward to seeing every day. We all left the classroom to go to the front of the building. Mr. Wade then gave us a checklist of things to hunt for, and we all set out. So there I was with my friend Ellen, looking for what was listed, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw a black van parked near the schoolyard. There appeared to be somebody in the driver's seat, watching us. I then walked over to Mr. Wade and asked if the van belonged to any of the staff. "I don't think so. Let's go ask the front office ladies if they know anything about it." Once the front office claimed that they knew nothing about the black van, I began to feel uneasy. Mr. Wade then told the rest of the class to come back inside. I could tell he was also feeling a bit apprehensive. At this time, Mr. Wade was by the school's front entrance, ushering the rest of the students back inside. When I made a poor decision, I approached the van to get a better look. I then noticed that the van's driver's side door was now open. Before I knew it, somebody had a hold of me and was forcing me into the van. I yelled for Mr. Wade to come help me, but it was too late. I was shoved into the van, and I began shouting at the top of my lungs, "Let me go! Let me go!" The man who kidnapped me looked me dead in the eye and said, "Shut up, kid, and don't try anything. You keep yelling like that, and I'll have to kill you." I then shouted, "Mr. Wade, help me!" I was then knocked unconscious. A while later I woke up, still in the van. The kidnapper had duct taped my hands behind my back and my mouth shut. We seemed to be parked somewhere away from the school. You're awake. You just sit there and be a good boy and don't make a sound. We're gonna go for a little drive soon. Everything will be fine." I can't describe how scared I was in that moment. My mind was racing, thinking about what this lunatic had planned for me. I can only remember brief flashes of what happened next. The driver's side window was shattered. I heard Mr. Wade's voice shouting. The van suddenly drove away, and the kidnapper became enraged, cursing up a storm. He eventually pulled over and exited the van, and that was the last I saw of him. To make a long story short, after the van left the school, with me inside of it, Mr. Wade immediately jumped into his own car and followed it to a parking lot a mile down the road. Once he saw it come to a stop, he snuck up to the driver's window and smashed it with a rock, hoping to take the kidnapper by surprise. However, he was able to pull away. For whatever reason, even though the kidnapper managed to escape Mr. Wade, he lost his nerve and abandoned me in the van on the side of the road. The police obviously got involved, and the man was arrested later that day. But if it wasn't for Mr. Wade, I probably wouldn't be here today telling this story. I want to forget about what happened, but this is something that you can never forget, no matter how hard you try. I just want everyone to be aware that there are evil people in this world that will strike when you least expect it. And if you see a sketchy vehicle parked somewhere it shouldn't be, for your own sake, don't approach it. A bit of backstory. In August of 2012, my mother-in-law was out on her morning walk, the same route she had taken since 1988. She had just received the all-clear on her breast cancer, and things were looking up. However, during her walk that day, a driver on his way to church lost control of his truck, crashing into a speed limit sign before swerving into the sidewalk, then proceeded to hit my mother-in-law, dragging her 100 feet before he came to a stop. Needless to say, my husband and I were devastated. Her loss left a deep scar on my soul. I was very close with her, which made the events of what happened after she departed this world all the more tragic. For a while, our family was living in a haze. We could not properly say goodbye, as she was unrecognizable. I can't even tell you how I managed to get through this ordeal. It was just one day at a time, I guess. 6 days after my mother-in-law's funeral, I purchased my first home. She got to see pictures of the house and helped me pick out paint colors prior to her death. We tried our best to move forward, changing from the apartment to the house, painting, cleaning, packing, moving, all that fun stuff. Trying to take our minds off the heartache and focus on fixing up the house, but her death still lingered and made these tasks even harder. By Christmas of that year, things had gotten worse. Christmas was her favorite holiday, and it would be our first without her. My husband had already been struggling with undiagnosed mental problems, ones that didn't seem to manifest until after we got married. There were no red flags during our dating phase or engagement period. He would try to numb it by drinking and using drugs. The death of his mother escalated things dramatically. That year, I struggled to decorate our home. None of us were in the holiday spirit. However, for the first time, I finally got to use this huge tree my godmother had given me several years prior. I was never able to set it up, as all the places we lived in before were too small for this tree. So after weeks of decorating and trying to meet my husband's unreasonable demands, I did what I could to satisfy at least one of his personalities. More on that later. As December 25th approached, he decided to gift himself with a bottle of whiskey and share some with the neighbors. We went to their house for a small get-together. However, when we returned to our house across the street, he decided that he was not quite finished with the bottle and continued to drink it until it was gone. At this point, he decides to pick a fight with me, although I can't remember what it was about. I do remember it was about Christmas. He goes off on a tangent about trees and Santa, etc., not being the real reason for Christmas. He was Catholic, and I'm not, so I reminded him that I was fully aware of the reason for Christmas, but that it was also about spending time with your family, and it's okay to indulge in a little consumerism every once in a while. This sets him off even more. He decides to pull my huge Christmas tree to the ground and does a sweep of the mantle, sending decorations crashing to the floor. He then proceeded to the kitchen and began to throw things against the wall. There was no Christmas decorations in there, but there was a family crystal bowl of mine that got tossed. This all happened in a matter of seconds. I had no time to react, and I could do nothing to stop him from doing more damage. He then made his way to the garage, which was connected to the kitchen, leaving me in the house, looking around the destroyed living room and the wrecked kitchen. All I could do was cry. I consider myself to be a strong person, but at that moment, I was broken. My world came crashing down around me. I didn't know what to do. Tears came rolling down my face as I picked up the shattered pieces of the antique family ornaments so that my dogs wouldn't step on anything and hurt themselves. At this point, my husband had come out of the garage. He didn't say a word as he walked through the glass and debris and straight to the bedroom, leading me to think that he was going to bed. How wrong I was. I settled down on the couch, thinking about what the hell I was going to do, when I heard him screaming and yelling.
"I'll kill everyone! Do you hear me? I'll kill everyone!"
So I ended up texting his best friend, we'll call him Jack, asking him to come over, since I couldn't seem to calm him down. When my husband returned to the living room, he had both of his pistols in his hands. As I stated before, he had no recorded history of mental illness, so he had no issues purchasing firearms in the past. He sets one of his guns down and pulls me off the couch, throwing me to the ground. I don't want to go into too much detail about what happened next, but I want to make it clear that he did not threaten me with the weapons, but he did try to get me to end his life. I finally got my hands free and continued to cry, begging him to stop. He sets his guns down on the floor and walked back into the garage. I quickly scooped them up to hide them. I called up my neighbors, the ones that we had visited earlier that night, and asked them if I could bring over the handguns for safekeeping. Thankfully, they were still awake, and they agreed to help me. The faster I got these out of the house, the better. Once I dropped them off, my neighbor, we'll call her Susan, came back over with me to make sure I was okay. She had seen the hand mark on my arm from where he pulled me off the couch. She even went out into the garage to talk with him. I was hoping it would calm him down, but this didn't seem to help. Before she left, she said that I could stay over at her place for the night, saying that since he's the one who made this mess, he could clean it up. Looking back, I think the only person that would have gotten through to him that night would have been his mother. I was still picking up glass, and I told her that I would be okay, and thanked her for coming over and trying to defuse the situation, and that I would come back over in a few days to get the guns, after everything had hopefully settled down. My husband's friend Jack shows up a short time later, and immediately goes into the garage. Honestly, I regretted calling him. I didn't know what my husband was doing in the garage, but he wasn't bothering me or destroying stuff around the house. After talking with Jack, he comes out and begins to yell and scream at me.
"Why would you call Jack over here? I said I'd kill everyone, don't you remember?"
Jack gets between us and tries calming him down. He turns back and addresses me. "It's probably not a good idea for you to be here right now." At this point, I had had enough of his shit. I took up Susan on her offer, hoping that it would give him time to cool off. Obviously, my husband didn't want to be around me right now, so I left for Susan's house. I'm not there 2 minutes when my phone starts blowing up with messages saying things like divorce and traitor, along with a novel-length rambling about what an evil person I was. As I sat there on the floor at my neighbor's house, I made the decision to return to my house. It was my house, after all. I was concerned that he might destroy more of my things, but was terrified that he would burn the house down, with my dogs trapped inside, which is something that he has threatened to do before. That thought alone was just unbearable. When I came back in, I was yelled at some more until Jack got him back into the garage. Poor Jack. I know that he probably had better things to do that night than to be caught in the middle of this drama. After a few minutes, I could hear things being thrown around, followed by grunts. My husband was going absolutely berserk. All the while, Jack was doing his best to calm him down, pinning him to the ground with an armbar. I later found dents in my car and more of my things destroyed. I don't know why my existence was setting him off so badly, but I immediately regretted my decision to return. But as I stated before, this was my house. If my soon-to-be ex-husband needed to go vent, he can go somewhere else with his friend. Maybe the cops would catch up with him, and he could spend the night in jail. I even went as far as to text his dad, letting him know what was going on with his son. His response was, "I don't know what to tell you. He's a grown man." Psh, I actually laughed when I read that text. I loved my mother-in-law, but my father-in-law was a real piece of shit. That woman deserved better. At around 5 a.m., he finally went to bed, and Jack crashed on the couch. I couldn't sleep, for obvious reasons. I ended up staying awake for more than 48 hours. I about lost my damn mind. Another thing to note is that I'm physically disabled after a car accident where a driver hit me while I was sitting at a stoplight. So between the chronic pain I already suffered with on a daily basis, I had to add on the stress caused by this shit show, not to mention the additional pain from being jerked off the couch and thrown to the floor. It was truly a living nightmare. I understand that he had problems, but I honestly tried to make my marriage work. Things had become toxic. There was only so much abuse I could take, and I finally filed for divorce some years later. I had hoped that his mental state would improve over time, but that never happened. He's now long gone from my life, but remembering all this still makes me shake with fear. That huge altercation around Christmas, after his mother's untimely death, marked the beginning of the end for our relationship, but I'm thankful that I made it out alive. A couple of years after this incident, I actually spoke with a psychologist. I was told that he likely had what is called borderline personality disorder. But keep in mind that this was just an educated guess. As you can imagine, there is a lot more to the story than what I mentioned here. What happened that night wasn't an isolated incident. In the time between what happened that night and our eventual divorce, I lived in a constant state of fear, anxiety, and stress. Bear in mind, his handguns were eventually returned to him, but I think he had to get rid of them after we divorced. I think he currently lives with his friend Jack. As far as I know, he doesn't have a job or any type of relationship and still has his temper tantrums from time to time. Thankfully, I no longer have to deal with it. I implore any woman dealing with a similar situation not to endure the same levels of abuse I did. There comes a point where you need to think about your own well-being. I was fortunate enough to get out alive, but not without trauma that I have to live with for the rest of my life. This incident happened in the spring of 2019. For some context, I'm a 23-year-old man. I have 2 brothers, and I come from a wealthy family. 4 years ago, we received a large inheritance from our grandfather. So my brothers and I decided to travel the world for 6 months. I booked multiple one-way flight tickets and 4-star hotels, including a trip to Martinique. It's a small island in the Caribbean and has a population of about 350,000 people. And I have 2 half-sisters, Anissa and Sabrina, who live there as well. On April 5th, 2019, it was time for me to head to Martinique. I would be staying at my sister's place during my 3-week stay. The first week there went well. My sisters showed me around the island and the beaches that were less populated by tourists. But the next week is where things took a turn for the worse. My sisters and I decided to go on a short getaway outside of the capital city and spend 2 days at a small secluded beach. We rented out a condo right on the shore. When we first arrived, everything was going great, but when nighttime rolled around, I decided to go on a walk just to get some alone time I even went into the water for a night swim. While I was relaxing in the water, I felt somebody grab the back of my neck and dunk my head into the water. I tried to get away, but the person behind me was too strong. I couldn't break the hold. But I did manage to get my head above the water and yell for help. My 2 sisters came running out, and luckily, Sabrina had a pistol with her. As soon as she saw the man pushing my head back into the water again, she fired off a shot that hit him in the back. It wasn't fatal, but it got him off of me. Anissa helped me back onto the shore, while my assailant silently crawled out of the water. The police arrived a short time later, and the man was arrested. The scariest part is that even with a bullet in his back, the man didn't make a sound or say a single word. As he was being hoisted into the ambulance, his cold eyes never stopped staring at me. I never thought something like this would ever happen to me. The rest of my time in Martinique went well, but I was happy to leave that place. It turns out that Martinique is not a very safe island. Outside of the capital city, there are many cases of homicides, kidnappings, sexual assaults, and drugs. To this day, I still travel often, but I'm much more cautious now, and I make sure to do some research before I visit a country I've never been to before. This happened in April of 2018. I live in a major city in Texas. My apartment complex is gated and in a pretty good neighborhood, but the security isn't the best. Sometimes the gates are left open, and anyone can piggyback off someone else entering with an access code. Twice in the past 3 years, the management has put out notices of vehicle break-ins or other items being stolen off porches. We also have frequent door-to-door solicitors, even though there are signs forbidding it. So on this particular Friday, I went to bed around 2:30 a.m. For some odd reason, I was having trouble going to sleep. So I put on a podcast to listen to, and I eventually start dozing off. I heard a clicking sound. I thought it might have been the upstairs neighbors making some noise. I kind of zoned this out, as I'm used to my neighbors staying up late on the weekends. After about 30 seconds, I realize the noise is extremely repetitive and getting louder. I then began focusing on it more intently, trying to isolate what it could be and where it was coming from. Suddenly, it hits me. It's coming from the entrance to my apartment. I leapt out of bed and head for the foyer. I identify the noise right away. The lock mechanism is moving back and forth rapidly, as if somebody is trying to unlock the front door. I can hear that an object is being inserted into the lock, and the person is trying to jimmy it back and forth. I instinctively turned around, head to my bedside safe, unlock it with a combination, and pull out my .357 pistol, and loaded a 14-round magazine, and chambered it with a hollow point round. I then head back to the front door. As I exit my bedroom, I see the lock twist. I immediately aimed my gun, knowing that if somebody came through, I would have to make a split-second decision. I decided that if somebody comes through the door, I would give them a momentary chance to retreat, but if they did anything other than that, or enter aggressively, I'm going to shoot and ask questions later. The inside latch lock prevented them from entering. When I first moved in, I remember thinking that the latch lock was a good security measure, and I had gotten into the habit of always keeping it locked when I'm home. In hindsight, this decision saved me from a life or death confrontation. Upon realizing that, I approached the door and looked through the peephole. On the other side were 2 men and 1 woman. All 3 were wearing hoodies, and it was difficult to make out their faces. The men seemed to have objects in their hands, but I couldn't make out exactly what. The two men were talking back and forth, possibly trying to figure out why they couldn't open the door, even though they had successfully opened the outside lock. The woman was also talking very loudly. Anyone in the hallway would have been able to hear her voice. She was speaking in another language. The only words I could make out were, "Apartment 250, and she kept repeating that over and over again, like a broken record. Upon hearing that, I start to wonder for a moment if maybe they're just drunk and have the wrong apartment number. But that's impossible. To open the lock, you have to have a copy of my exact key or some kind of lock-picking device. I've never copied my key or given it to anyone. Here's another thing. Not only is 250 not my apartment number, that apartment number does not exist anywhere in the complex. Standing back from my door, I took a long broom handle and jabbed it hard into the surface of the door, letting them know that I'm on the other side. They immediately stopped playing around with the lock and took off running. I debated whether or not to call 911 and decided against it, unless they came back. I know that they're going to be long gone by the time anyone gets here, and it would have been too risky to try and follow them to get a better description or a license plate. I didn't have enough identifying information. I filed a police report the next day and gave my apartment manager a heads up. They said it was unusual, but they would alert the resource officer and asked for a police presence for the next couple of nights. Nothing ever came of the report, but that wasn't a surprise to me. Nobody else in the apartment has ever reported anything similar happening. One precaution I took was to replace the latch with a smart lock, so it could always be locked from the inside, even when I'm not home. It's crazy to think that a latch was the only thing preventing an armed confrontation between myself and the intruders. They say you don't really know what you'll do in situations like this until it actually happens. If one good thing came out of this, I feel confident that I responded in the right way and was ready for the unthinkable. I live in a small city, and nothing much exciting happens around here, especially in my neighborhood. It's pretty rare to even see a car pass by after 10 p.m. I am a 21-year-old male, and I spend most nights playing video games or reading. I rent a 2-bedroom apartment under my parents' house with my sister and her 3-year-old son. She doesn't stay home most nights, and my dad works 2 hours away from home, so generally, I'm alone from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. The street I live on gets really dark, and my house is the last one on this end. From my house to the crossroad is about the distance of a football field. The first time I saw the flashlight guy was about a month and a half ago. As I said before, the neighborhood shuts down by 10, so it seemed odd when I went out for a smoke and saw a man dressed in all black with his hood pulled up, walking down my street. But I brushed it off as I finished my cigarette and went back inside. I went to my bedroom and began reading a book. 15 minutes later, I see a flashlight beam sweep through my windows. I should mention that one whole wall of my bedroom is all windows. At this point, I was pretty unnerved, so I put down my book and went to go check things out. I didn't see anything at first, so I chalked it up to me being paranoid and sat back down. But it wasn't long before it happened again. By now, I knew that something was wrong, and I had a really bad feeling in my stomach. I just wanted to ignore it and hope it would just go away. But I urged myself to be a man and look out the window. Looking outside, I noticed the man from earlier, standing about 15 feet away, shining his flashlight directly in front of him. He wasn't moving. I stood there for a couple of minutes, wondering what the hell he was doing, until he swept his flashlight across the whole downstairs of my house. As I said before, no one besides me was home. I was pretty creeped out by this point, and I wasn't sure what to do. So I went upstairs and through the door that separates my apartment from my dad's, and went to his room to grab the shotgun. When I got back downstairs and looked out the window, the man was gone. I stayed up for the rest of that night, checking every 10 minutes to see if he would come back. This has happened twice more, and he always does the same thing. Sweeps his flashlight through my house, and then just stands there. I've gotten to where I always sleep with my dad's shotgun next to my bed. My dad says that it's weird, and tells me to stay inside whenever I see him, and to call the cops if I feel threatened. Anybody that does this kind of thing obviously doesn't have the best intentions, so I understandably feel a bit more threatened every time he shows back up. Fast forward to 2 days ago. Once again, I'm all by myself. My microwave is broken, so I've been making it a habit to go upstairs and use the kitchen whenever I'm by myself. I forgot to mention that the only door out of my apartment besides going through the garage is in my room. This is important to remember. I made myself some food and went back downstairs. When I got into my room, it was freezing cold. I live in Vermont, so this time of year I always left my door shut and locked and put a towel under it. I use the garage to go in and out of the house because as soon as I open my door, all the heat escapes my room. I always keep the heat cranked all winter because my room is the coldest in the entire house. When I looked at my thermostat, it was shut off. I turned it back up, and I was really unnerved because I had just turned it up about an hour ago. As I said before, I never turn it off because of how cold my room gets. I felt a breeze on my back, and I turned around to see my door partially opened. I quickly close and lock it. But not before I peeked outside, and sure enough, I saw the flashlight guy's light go out as he turns the corner at the end of my street. The next day I told one of my neighbors about what happened, and they told me just a couple of weeks prior, a woman that lives in the same neighborhood was alone, watching TV with her daughter, when someone broke in. I guess they heard the intruder coming through the door and locked themselves in their bathroom and called the cops. Whoever broke in must have taken off when he heard the sirens, because when the police got there, the back door was wide open and nobody was in the house. I don't know who this flashlight guy is, or what the hell he went into my bedroom for, but at this point, as you can imagine, it's got me on edge. Since the other night, nothing more has happened. I've been keeping a light on outside, and a couple more throughout the house during nights, so it doesn't look like I'm the only one here at night from now on. A few years ago, I was renting a house in Northern California. The neighborhood was just outside the suburbs. It seemed like the perfect balance of having space and having nice neighbors close enough not to feel isolated. The area had no streetlights, so it was very dark at night, especially when there were clouds blocking the moonlight. I got home from work one day in midwinter. It was a cloudy night, so pulling up to my house, I saw only what my headlights and front porch light illuminated. When I exited my car, I caught the faint whiff of cigarette smoke. That was odd, but I didn't see anybody outside, so I ignored it and went in. I just got off my shift with a few hours overtime, so I felt pretty tired. Even though it wasn't even 7 o'clock yet, I decided to take a shower and call it a night. I woke up sometime later. I was sure that I heard a noise inside of my house. I wasn't worried right away, because my friend would sometimes stop by to use my shower after work. I even gave him a spare key. However, he would always text me beforehand, and I hadn't heard my phone go off. I reached over to my bedside table to see if my friend had sent me a text. The bright light from my phone's screen blinded me. These were the days before phones had light sensors that would dim the screen in the dark, and this particular phone was so bright that I could use it as a flashlight. I squinted my eyes and could make out that it was 9-something in the morning, but I couldn't tell if I had an unread message in my inbox or not. I set down my phone and called out my friend's name. There was a couple of seconds of silence, followed by a loud footfall as someone started moving through the bottom floor of my house. I leapt out of bed and ran to the closet. They were already up the stairs by the time I opened the door and stepped inside. The house had 3 rooms upstairs, the bedroom that I was in, and a spare, with a bathroom at the end. The bedroom doors were both closed, but the bathroom door was cracked open. I heard whoever was in my house thunder down the hallway past my door and into the bathroom. That gave me enough time to open the attic access in my ceiling and hoist myself inside. I had just started to lift myself up when the person came barging out of the bathroom. My feet were barely inside the attic when my bedroom door flew open. I heard the footsteps run into my room and then stop. When they didn't see me in that room, they ran back to the hallway and into the other room, which had boxes stacked in the corner, some weights, and a table where I painted my miniature models. I guess they decided that if someone was hiding, it would be in the first bedroom, because they charged back into my room and turned on the light. A moment later, the closet door was ripped open. I was crouched in my attic, just a foot or so away from the access, so I could try to stop them if they began to climb up. From my vantage point, I could see from about their knees down. They were wearing a dirty pair of blue jeans with frayed cuffs and worn-out work boots. After a few seconds of looking around my closet, they stepped away, and I heard a loud crash come from my room, followed by a scream of frustration. The scream was the most unnerving part of the incident for me. It reminded me too much of my stepfather, who would shout in a similar way whenever he lost his temper. He would eventually be committed to a mental hospital. The man inside of my house ran back down the stairs. I heard crashes and clatters as things were thrown around and furniture was knocked over. I stayed hidden in the attic. I left my cell phone by my bed when I ran for the closet. I wasn't certain if I could climb down without him hearing. After some time, the noises stopped. I started counting slowly. When I reached 1,000, I decided it was safe enough to climb down and call the cops. The first thing I noticed when I exited the closet was the intruder had flipped over my bed, I assume in some attempt to find me. I couldn't find my cell phone, so I used my landline to call the cops. I waited in my room until I heard them call out from downstairs. The first floor was a mess, but that was something I expected. Chairs had been knocked over, the sofa had been flipped, all the books, pictures, and knickknacks I had on my shelves were strewn across the floor. The cupboards in the kitchen had been opened, and all the boxes and cans had been thrown to the ground. As far as I could tell, though, the only thing that was missing was a single knife out of the wooden block in my kitchen. The police checked my house from top to bottom. They found out that the side door had been forced open by a crowbar. They also found a few cigarette butts along the fence line, along with some foil and an empty pen tube, which the police said people often use to smoke meth. So whoever it was had been watching my house for a while. I realized that he must have been smoking a cigarette when I got home. They collected up the evidence and told me that I should stay with friends and family for the rest of that night and get the door fixed as soon as possible. I opted to just not sleep and moved a shelf over to block the broken door and spent the next few hours cleaning things up. I would often go to the window with a flashlight and shine it along the fence where the police had found the cigarette butts, but I never saw anything. The next day I called to have the door fixed and motion lights installed at the back and sides of my house. I ran a phone cable into the attic and added a landline. I never wanted to be stuck up there without a phone again. I lived there for another 3 years without incident. One more precaution I took was practicing getting out of my bed, going to my closet, and climbing into the attic as quickly and quietly as possible. I even kept at it when I moved, except now I go to a crawl space in the back of my closet. I try not to think about what would have happened if I had been just a bit slower, or if he hadn't gone into the bathroom before making his way to my bedroom. For the sake of the story, I'm going to call myself Brad. This happened around Christmas of last year. I'm a 25-year-old man, and I live in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. But I have many family members who live in Miami, Florida. So every Christmas, I usually take a trip down to Miami to spend some time with my family over the holidays. Last year, I stayed at my cousin's house. I'll refer to them as Jack, Jason, and Adrian. When I got there, we hung out with my aunts and uncles and generally had a good time catching up and whatnot. I'm going to provide some pretext before I get into what happened. My cousins and I are big horror fans, and we enjoy watching and listening to horror stories on YouTube, from channels like Unit 522, Mr. Nightmare, and Southern Cannibal. We also sometimes liked going on night drives while listening to the stories. It was the night of December 27th, and my cousins and I decided to go out at around 2:30 a.m. But Adrian had a bright idea. "Hey guys, instead of taking the car, how about going out on foot tonight?" "Dude, really? You're crazy. We're in Florida. We're gonna get eaten alive by mosquitoes. Come on, man, don't be such a punk. I need to save money on gas anyways." Unfortunately, Jack and Jason agreed with Adrian. I gave in to the peer pressure and went along with the plan, although something told me that this was a very bad idea. After about an hour of walking, we decided to head into this poorly lit neighborhood just off the main road. I thought this was a stupid idea, and I vocalized my concerns. "I don't think this is such a good idea, guys." Adrian, being the big tough guy he is, responded with, "What's with you tonight, Brad?" He then flexed his bicep. "Do you see this? If anyone messes with us, I'll put them through a windshield. Now stop being such a crybaby and come on. Everything will be fine." So, with that, we walked into the neighborhood. About half of the streetlights were out, and the ones that still worked were flickering or were on the verge of blowing out. After a while, we saw a bench and decided to sit down and take a short break. About 30 minutes later, we heard gunshots in the distance. They sounded like they could be automatic weapons. We all stood up and looked toward the neighborhood entrance. An SUV came speeding into the neighborhood. "What the hell?" Adrian shouted. "I told you this was a bad idea. We need to get the hell out of here." But before we could flee, the SUV was already upon us. It looked like a black, late-model Dodge Durango. We all backed away as a man wearing a ski mask got out of the passenger seat and pointed a pistol at us.
If any of you move, I'm gonna fucking blow your brains out all over the street. Hand over your wallets now.
My cousins were all frozen, but I quickly took my wallet out and gave the masked man the $50 I had on me. My cousins then handed over what they had as well, all while being screamed at and having a gun pointed at their faces. When he had all the money, he then said something that made my heart stop.
All of you are taking a little ride with us tonight. Now get in the fucking car.
My cousins and I all looked at each other, not saying anything. We all knew that we were going to die that night. But by pure luck, the driver said,
"Hey, we're not taking anyone tonight. Let's go." Well, boys, it's your lucky night, I guess.
He ran to the SUV, and they sped away into the darkness. And just like that, it was all over. We were all pretty shaken up about what just happened. When you go walking around Miami at night, you know that you're taking a risk, but that still does a little to mitigate the trauma. After collecting ourselves, we decided to get the hell out of there. We didn't bother calling the police, because we couldn't give a physical description, and the Durango didn't have any visible license plate I would have remembered. So there wouldn't be much that they could have done. We also didn't tell our family because, while they would have felt bad for us, they would have given a shit about being stupid enough to go out on foot at 2 a.m. They would have been right, but still, we didn't want to hear it. We still go out at night sometimes whenever we get together, but we always take the car now. Adrian realized that he was not as tough as he liked to believe himself to be. My advice to anyone listening: you may think you're a big tough guy, but it doesn't matter how big your biceps are. When a maniac points a gun at you, shit can go south real quick. Every town has a story about something horrible that has happened in its past. I like to share the story of what happened in my hometown years ago. I'm sure those of you who live in the big cities are somewhat used to hearing about stories like this happening on a weekly basis, which is sad. But out here, in the less populated areas, stories like this almost become an urban legend. I actually witnessed a small part of what took place that night, so that's where I'll begin. I was chilling on my couch one night, watching TV with a bowl of popcorn by my side. I was kind of dozing off when I heard a loud bang at my back door. Not like a gunshot, it was more like something being knocked over. I got up and checked things out, but I saw nothing. I figured that the neighborhood cats were fighting again, and something got knocked over in the process. That's happened before. So I sat back down to finish what I was watching before calling it a night. I then heard some commotion in my backyard. I quickly got up and looked out my back window to see a young girl running through my backyard. She looked scared for her life. There was a man wearing a mask who was chasing after her, yelling for her to stop. It was like something straight out of a horror movie. After they disappeared from view, I immediately called the police. Now, I wasn't in any direct danger, but what I witnessed was only a very small part of what took place that night. The rest of this story is pieced together from news articles and reports. The man in the mask was a manic depressive who refused to take his medication. He left his apartment that night and proceeded to have a complete nuclear meltdown. He absolutely lost his mind. The woman I saw in my backyard was stabbed over 17 times and was found dead a block down the road from my house. A short time after that, he terrorized a bunch of people at a bus stop. Eyewitness reports stated that he was laughing like a lunatic and engaged in self-harm. After leaving the bus stop, he was able to flag down a taxi, which drove him back to his apartment. But instead of paying the driver, he murdered him. When his neighbors saw him stumbling into his apartment, covered in blood, holding a knife, they immediately called the cops. I'm assuming by this point that the police had already heard about what happened at the bus stop and the poor girl that was found stabbed to death. And when they discovered the dead taxi driver outside his apartment building, they connected the dots and knew that they had found the man responsible for this murderous rampage. His apartment was surrounded and a standoff ensued. Unfortunately, nothing they did seemed to calm him down, and he ended up taking his own life that night. He left behind 2 children, a pregnant wife, and his elderly mother, who had cancer. The psychiatrist he was seeing was accused of malpractice for not prescribing him the correct medication. It was a mess, but I don't think any charges were filed against him. That night still haunts the people of this town, and you can still feel a sense of unease whenever the sun goes down around here. The story I'm about to tell you is one that has had a negative effect on my life. I'm not sure how this will come out. I have never tried writing this memory down before. I'm almost 26 now, and at the time that this took place, I was 18. I'm also female, if that matters. At the time, way back when I was 18, I was fascinated by sculpting and pottery. I was attending college in the next town, doing a beauty therapist course that I really ended up having no interest in. I met a whole lot of creeps, but that's a story for another time. I managed to find a pottery class in my town, so I would catch the bus back into town, attend the class, and then walk home from there. I was going to this class for about 2 months before the guy who would change everything walked in. He was visibly shy and anxious. So cool, I thought. I also suffered from anxiety, so I thought we already had some common ground. His name was Francis. Francis would never look you in the eye. He would sometimes look from one point to another, just above your head when he was talking to you. When he was listening, he would stare at the floor. He was very intelligent and was very interesting to talk to and had a lot of cool ideas about life. I liked him. He was about 6 foot, dark, and handsome. Long story short, when he told me that we were the same age, I was pretty happy. We started hanging out outside of the pottery class. I even went to his house a couple of times and met his parents and sister. His sister was a lot younger than him. I don't remember how old exactly. His mom was Polish, but spoke excellent English. His dad reminded me of Carlisle Cullen. By the way his look made me shiver. There was a coldness behind his eyes. It would eventually phase out and ended up looking like pure hatred. By this point, we had become an item. His parents were delighted and immediately began discussing marriage, and that kind of creeped me out. It wasn't even in a joking manner, like parents sometimes do to embarrass you. They made it sound like I had entered a contract. My first real red flag was how intense Francis became. Only after the first couple of days we became boyfriend and girlfriend. He would handwrite me poems, ranging from 3 to 6 pages in length. And in all honesty, it was some of the best poetry I had ever read. My favorite being, "Dive for Dreams." It turns out he plagiarized that from E. Cummings, word for word. I thought he was joking, or wanted to impress me, but couldn't write himself, so I ignored the compulsive lying regarding his poetry. Then the onslaught of calls and texts began. I would silence my phone during class, and when I checked it at any point in the day, I would have a terrifying number of missed calls, sometimes in the hundreds, not joking, and messages that were so long, I didn't even finish most of them. They were all ramblings of how his love for me surpassed his own will to live. I was his heir and reason, and he would do anything for me. Again, this was only days into our relationship. I should have been seriously put off, right? But this is where I felt sorry for him. I did what you should never do and ignored my gut instinct. He was pretty isolated apart from his own family and me. He had no other friends. I just thought he was attention-starved and it would level out in time. This is where things spiraled out of control. Shortly after my birthday, Francis had settled down with the calls and texts, but I still got quarter-hourly calls, sometimes even during the night. Now, bearing in mind, we hadn't done anything at this point, other than kissing. At the time, I had a really big thing about not feeling ready to go further with him, and I didn't ignore that. We had sent a couple of pictures to each other. Never do this, by the way. It never ends well. And his mom found them. Well, no. To be specific, he showed them to her. His mom went ballistic. One morning I checked my phone before leaving for class, and apart from the usual missed calls from Francis, I had 14 from his mom. Weird. So I hit redial. She immediately informed me that she had spoken to a lawyer and was going to ruin my life. I could almost hear her spitting as she screamed into the phone at me, calling me names, and at one point threatening my entire family. I was stumped. It was a massive overreaction to a couple of topless photos and some cringy, dirty talk. I was pretty freaked out, though. This was when she said it, and my stomach almost fell out of me. "He's 13, you pedophile. I am going to ruin your life." She had gone along with him being 18. Why would somebody hope her own son lie about his age? He looked, behaved, and spoke like somebody my age. She twisted a bunch of evidence together out of the messages and pictures and claimed that she was going to go to the police with it. I was an adult, and where I live, you can get charged for something like this and do some serious time. But they were clever about it, almost as if they had planned this all along. Because I had absolutely no evidence other than my word of them saying that he was, in fact, my age. And she flat out denied that she ever said that, and had always told me that he was 13, and was never happy with the relationship I had with her son. Soon, my other friends stopped talking to me. People on campus would stare at me, and I got hate mail, all because a rumor went around that I was a child abuser. I ceased contact with Francis and his family. They eventually said that they would not go to the police, only because they had accidentally deleted the evidence. I was too scared to tell anyone. She was so descriptive to me over the phone about how she would ruin my life, and would also destroy my family's lives as well. I just hoped it would go away. Soon after that, I quit college, and I didn't go out much. I was getting death threats, and I knew if I went to the police, I was scared that I would actually be accused of being a child abuser. I had a complete mental breakdown. Francis wouldn't stop contacting me. He would threaten to kill me and set my house on fire if I didn't come back to him. He also kept sending me this very horrific footage that I don't even think was legal. He also threatened to end himself and said a bunch of other messed up things to get a reaction out of me. And the entire time, he knew that I would not go to the police because there was always a chance that his mom lied about deleting the evidence. I never replied to him though. For months, the messages continued. I blocked him every time they came up and would make new accounts. But I never quite figured out how he still managed to find me. Later in the year, he managed to get himself a new girlfriend, and after a while of being involved with her, there was an incident where he held her at knife point after his parents left him to babysit his sister because she refused to be intimate with him. She managed to lock herself inside the bathroom, where he proceeded to stab through the door with a kitchen knife. His parents got back but refused to believe the girl's story. But something happened, and Francis lost it and ended up stabbing his own mom in the shoulder. It was only then that the police were called, and the girl was escorted out of the house safely. He was diagnosed with autism and never faced any charges. Personally, I've never met anybody with autism who is anything remotely like Francis, so I'm skeptical, but again, I don't know for sure. As I mentioned at the beginning of this story, I'll be 26 soon, so this happened years ago. I haven't heard anything about Francis since he stabbed his mom, and I hope it stays that way. This experience happened to my roommates and I in our second year of university. The city we went to school in was considered a very safe university town. The most we ever heard of happening was drunk morons doing typical drunk moron things. This was also the first time we were living on our own. First-year residents are nice, but it's typically an extended summer camp, rather than a typical living situation. The four of us girls lived in a nice town home. We never had a creepy vibe or a weird neighbor in the time that we lived there. The only eerie part was that every weekend, we were the only people who stayed in the complex. All of our neighbors either went home or stayed elsewhere until returning for Monday classes. This was never something we had given a second thought to, considering this was fairly normal for college students, especially because our complex was only made up of 4 other town homes. The property was surrounded by walking trails and farmland, which we loved. It was like our quiet spot away from the chaos of the college life. There was a few farmhouses we could see from our backyard. Aside from that, we were fairly secluded. The university was about a 20-minute bus ride away, which was never a big deal for any of us, especially since the rent here was far cheaper than the places that were within walking distance of the campus. Being 5'6", I was the tallest of our group. I was also the only one who had a handful of scary situations that I've dealt with. Due to this, I was the only one up to this point who would lock the doors, windows, and garage before leaving or going to bed. All my roommates grew up in small, very safe towns, and it was uncommon for them to lock doors back home. They were all incredibly kind and trusting to everyone, never considering hidden motives or bad intentions. On the night in question, things started off as usual. We had planned on having some wine and movie night. It was kind of a weekly tradition for us. We would pick out some stupid movie, order some takeout, and get a little buzz after a long week of classes and work. By this time, I want to say it was early November, and we had been doing this for several months with no issues. By 8:30, we all had settled down on the couch in our living room and started watching a comedy. Around this time of year, it's completely dark outside. Aside from our porch light, which we could see from the small window at the very top of our front door, none of us were tall enough to see anything out of the window, so we relied entirely on the peephole. It took a great amount of effort for me to convince my roommates to check the peephole before opening the door. This was a talk we had after one of our roommates had opened the door for some drunk neighbor's friend, who threw up all over our main floor. Not long after ordering takeout, we heard a bang on our front door. My friend Jess made a joke about how the delivery guy must have taken a helicopter to get here so fast, especially considering the place we ordered from was very close to campus. It was not a typical delivery guy's knock either. But between the few glasses of wine we had and the carefree attitude of the night, we didn't really pay it too much mind. It was my roommate's turn to pay this week. I'll call her Meg for the sake of this story. Out of our group, she is the smallest, barely 5 foot. She is also the most naive and trusting person I think I've ever met. She ran up to her room to grab her wallet. This took almost 30 seconds. During this short amount of time, the banging continued and was getting more and more aggressive. I figured maybe it was cold, or this guy had other shit to do, so we yelled at her to hurry up. The banging continued, getting louder and louder. I began to feel uneasy. When she came down, I told her to check before opening the door, as she's usually the one that just opens up. She got to the door and looked through the peephole. She could barely reach it on a good day, so when she couldn't see anything on the other side, my roommate got up to help. Her name is Jess, and she's a very funny person. There are very few things that she would not turn into a joke. When Jess got to the door and looked out the peephole, the person on the other side was still banging away. She then turned to me, and I knew that something was wrong. She looked very confused, something that I had rarely ever seen from her. She then took another look. This time her face was not confused. She looked frightened. This made my stomach knot up. She's a horror film fanatic, and she doesn't scare easy. I think somebody is covering up the peephole. At this point, I got up and looked out the hole. And yes, somebody was definitely covering it. I could still see the porch light shining through the window at the top, so we knew that this was not a case of it being too dark. By now, our other roommate, who I will call Annie, had made her way down the hallway trying to find out what was going on. She was easily the drunkest out of all of us, but even when she was sober, she seemed to think that she was invincible. What's the problem? Open the door. The poor guy has his hands full. Jess and I explained what was going on. At this point, all of us, aside from Annie, had a gut feeling that something was wrong. This is when Jess asked Meg to check our order status on the website. This is when she realized that she had not placed the order. I guess we could not handle our alcohol as well as we thought. She had selected our food but didn't finish the last step. The banging continued as our situation started to sink in. Annie didn't seem to grasp what was happening and tried to unlock the door. "Stop!" I snapped at her. Immediately I knew it was too loud. For the first time, the person on the other side of the door spoke up. "This is the police. Open up now. We have a few questions to ask you." This sobered me up right away. I looked over at Meg, who was already welling up, and then at Jess, who had gone completely pale. By this time, Annie had also realized that something wasn't right and froze up, which was the best thing Annie could have done. The banging was now getting louder, to the point where we could see the door shaking with each hit. Meg took Annie upstairs, trying to calm each other down, and to check if there was a police car parked outside, and to ensure that all the windows were locked. "Show me your badge, and then we'll open the door." Instead of a response, the guy then started to kick the door. I told Jess to call the police and ask the officer if they had been dispatched to our address. Jess was shaking so badly at this point, it was hard for her to dial the numbers. Meg had come back down the stairs and informed us that there was no police car parked outside. Annie trailed behind her, trying to get a good look outside the window at the top of the door. At that moment, my blood ran cold. The man at the back door said, "We," and not "I." Jess had come to the same realization, and she sprinted to our back door, which was a large sliding glass door. She double-checked that it was locked. Thankfully, it was. She drew the curtains as well, trying to minimize the chance of them seeing inside. Within a minute, the knocking started at our back door as well. Thank God she had closed the curtains, because the idea of seeing whoever was doing this to us still gives me the creeps.
"Take your hand off the peephole and show me your badge,"
I said again, trying to sound as intimidating as a young college girl could. We were met with silence, which was worse than the banging.
"What is your badge number at least? Prove to us that you are police,"
I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. The only response I got back was, "I can't do that." Jess had handed off her phone to Meg, who was sobbing at this point, trying to talk to the dispatcher. The banging was now coming from both sides of our house. It was so loud that the operator heard it. "Is there somebody trying to break in your house?" I heard them asking Meg. They were obviously having a hard time understanding anything she said. Meg frantically asked if the police had been sent to our house. The answer we all knew by now was no. Meg babbled that at least 2 men tried to get us to unlock the door by impersonating a police officer. "Try to stay calm and stay on the phone with me. The real police are on their way to your address now."
"How long will they be?"
"No more than 10 minutes. That made Meg cry even harder, realizing just how long 10 minutes really is. The door was being hit so hard that I was worried it was going to break. Jess ran back to the kitchen, making me worried that a window had been left open. Trying to think, I put a chair under the doorknob and sat down, hoping the door would hold. Jess came back from the kitchen, holding a cooking knife and a fire extinguisher, which were the only things we had to protect ourselves in case they got inside. Annie was now sitting on the landing, flinching with each hit. She grew up on a farm and had no issues dealing with animals 3 times her size. What was happening now, though, was entirely different. She grew up having family as her neighbors her entire life. If anything were to happen, her uncles and grandfather would be at her front door in a minute flat. The "I am invincible" attitude was now gone, and she was now as scared as the rest of us. Each hit to the back door made me worried the glass would break. "Open the door, now," the man demanded, not caring if we thought they were police or not. Then it got very quiet again, which made me want to throw up. The only thing worse than what was happening was not knowing where the men were. The idea of both of them moving to the back door made me absolutely terrified. If they really wanted to, they could smash through that plate glass. Instead, the knocking at the back door had ceased entirely. Within seconds of that, the front door started being hit again. Trying to wrap my mind around why they would leave the easiest entry for a heavy wooden door, I realized that the back door was visible to the main road. Whether they had seen a car or heard us talking to the police, they were smart enough to not want to be seen by anyone. Jess then said something that I hadn't thought of.
"I don't think they want to rob us. There are so many houses that are empty. Why would they come to the only house with the lights on?"
My whole body went cold. I didn't have an answer. All I could say was,
"Shit, you're right."
Meg clearly felt the same way, because at this point, she was practically hyperventilating. The 3 of us stayed quiet for a minute, awful scenarios running through our minds. Annie moved back at the last few steps and out of sight. The operator, who we had forgotten was on speakerphone, practically made me jump out of my skin. They must have heard how terrified we were and tried to calm us down. "The police are 2 minutes away. You should be able to see them very soon. Stay on the phone with me so I can confirm that they're outside." The men outside were starting to become desperate. The sound of glass shattering had me turning to the back door, fully expecting to go into offense, but the door was still intact. Instead, our porch light had been taken out, which put 2 and 2 together for me. understanding that they had destroyed the only thing that would help us identify them.
You little whores.
It was a voice we hadn't heard before. It must have been whoever was at the back door. His words were full of hate and venom. It scared me much more than the banging. It didn't feel like the first man we heard. It was much worse. He seemed so calm, intent on whatever his goal was. Up until this point, I could have convinced myself that they wanted our valuables, but this voice made me understand what they really wanted. To this day, I've never heard a voice come close to that level of malice. It sounded like he wanted to inflict harm on us, and if he gained entry into our house, I knew that's exactly what he was going to do. I looked over at Meg. I know how terrified I must have looked. Until now, I had done a half-decent job hiding my fear. But that voice I heard ruined my ability to stay stone-faced. Meg looked like a scared little girl, and that made me panic. If they got inside, there was nothing I would have been able to do to stop them. We would have been at the mercy of the monsters outside. It became so quiet that it sounded like a shotgun had gone off when Annie ran back down the stairs.
"I hear the sirens outside. They're coming down the road now,"
she said in a hushed voice, hoping that the men outside wouldn't hear her. I think she was so scared that she didn't realize that the men would have been able to hear the sirens as well. The same man we heard before spoke again, in that same awful, calm voice. He read aloud a letter that was addressed to the four of us, that our neighbor must have put in our mailbox. She mentioned something about a potluck happening the next week. None of us thought to check the mailbox after we talked to her in the driveway this morning.
Jess, Meg, and Annie. I'll be seeing you girls soon. Then we'll have some fun.
I felt tears rolling down my face. I hadn't realized that I started crying. I knew he meant what he said. I tried to pull my mind out of the dark pit it was in, waiting and praying that the police would come and arrest them, hoping that they would never get a chance to come back. None of us dared to speak. I was worried that we wouldn't hear them if they moved to another point of entry. Instead, the silence persisted for what felt like a lifetime. The dispatcher was the first to speak again, telling us that the police were outside, and told us to stay in the house until they knocked on the door. They stayed on the phone with us for several more minutes while the police searched around the area. Finally, the real police showed their badge to the peephole before even knocking, trying not to scare us. The dispatcher told us that we had done well and that we were in good hands now. We opened the door and were met by two kind-looking older police officers who we let in. Glass shards covered our front porch. It looked like our light had been ripped out of the wall and smashed to the ground. There were several police cars out front of our previously quiet home. All the headlights were shining down the street toward the walking trail. We gave our statement to the officers. They asked us to describe the night's events in detail and if we could provide a physical description. And we explained how the peephole had been covered and the porch light had been smashed before we could get a look at them. They advised us to speak to our landlord about installing security cameras. Then the older officer closed his pad and looked up at us. What he said made me understand how much danger we had been in. Look, if any of you were my daughters, I would have wanted the officer to tell her this. If you guys can get out of your lease, then do it. They all know where you live and they also know our response time, especially after he told you that he would be back. They asked us if we had heard a vehicle at any point, and that was something that I had not considered. None of us heard any kind of engine sounds until the police were there. Meg and Annie had seen no cars on the street at all. So this meant that they had come from the walking path, which would explain how they left without passing by the police. The older officer had a look that told me he had an idea of what was going on. It was almost a sad expression. I knew that he had seen this type of situation before. I tried probing him for an explanation, but he only told us that there had been an issue years ago, but did not elaborate beyond that.
We'll have a cruiser parked in the driveway, as well as an unmarked car around back. They won't have the chance to try this again. Tonight.
They never caught the men, and we only stayed there for 2 more weeks. The reality was, they could have come back at any time. After what happened that night, we spoke to our landlady, and she was incredible to us. She owned several properties around the city, and when we explained what happened, she let us move into an apartment that was closer to campus. She said that our safety was more important than making a few $100s. She even left the house empty for many months in order to make sure that cameras, better locks, and a reinforced back door was installed. Thankfully, we were able to enjoy our new apartment without worrying about anything. Make sure you lock your doors and always check who's there before opening up. This happened in 2016, when I was 17 years old, in my first year as a college student. I'm now 22, and my name is Julia. I lived alone in my first apartment. It was very small, but I was proud of my independence. I had never felt unsafe in this apartment complex for several reasons. There were multiple gates that had to be opened by a code that only residents knew. My door had 3 different locks, and it was right next to the university, so most people who lived there were also college students. Nothing bad had ever really happened in the neighborhood before. I've always been very careful with locking the door. Whenever I left my apartment, I always checked twice. So one day, I left to go to class and locked my door. But for some reason, I couldn't get the key out of the lock. It was completely jammed. So I went to look for the caretaker of the building to help me out, but he wasn't there, and I was going to be late for class. So I left with the key still in the lock. I took off the keychain first, so it wouldn't be too noticeable. When I got back home, the caretaker was back, so he came to help me out. We couldn't get it out for about 15 minutes, and he told me that the lock was damaged, but I didn't necessarily need to change it if I used the other 2 locks on the door. I just said okay, and that was the end of it. I wasn't too worried because of how safe I felt in this building. Fast forward 2 months later. I was taking out the trash one night around 11 p.m. while I was on the phone with my sister. I remember telling her that I was taking out the trash and that I would be taking a shower afterward, before heading over to a party. As I stated before, I had always locked the door, even just to take out the trash. When I got back to my apartment, I found my door unlocked, which immediately alarmed me. So I entered my apartment, making sure to lock it back. My apartment was about 215 square feet. To the left of the main room was the bathroom door, which was slightly open, enough so I could see someone hiding in my shower. Naturally, when I saw this, I tried to open the door and leave as fast as possible. But somehow, the latch bolt on the damaged lock had re-entered the strike on the doorframe and was now effectively locked, trapping me inside the apartment with whoever was in my bathroom. I couldn't open it, no matter how hard I tried. In this moment, all I could think of was how to leave as fast as possible. I jumped out of the window without really thinking about it. I figured it was the only way. However, I was on the 2nd floor, so I completely smashed my ankles on the landing. Despite this, I began running. To be honest, I couldn't feel any pain. When I got a bit further away from the building, I looked back, and saw a figure at my window, watching me as I ran away. I thought of two possible outcomes. Either the man was going to jump and chase after me, or he would get scared of the height and be locked inside my apartment. Thankfully, he picked option 2. I hid behind some bushes and called the police, who arrived in just 10 minutes. The police station was nearby. They forced open my door, and the man was there just sitting on my couch, holding a knife. They arrested him on the spot, and I later found out that his rap sheet included sexual assault, attempted kidnapping, and attempted murder. They also told me how this happened. As I said before, it's a friendly neighborhood, with mostly college students. He got inside the building by other people holding the door open for him. He then overheard me telling my sister on the phone that I was going to take a shower. He then crocheted my lock while I was taking out the trash and waited for me in the bathroom. I don't live there anymore, but after that, to get into the building, we all needed identification, proving that we lived there. Thankfully, nothing like that has happened in that neighborhood since.
There's always a reason to be afraid.